This episode of Us and Them was first released in December of 2021. It contains strong and offensive language and may not be suitable for all listeners. Hey there, this is Trey Kay. I'm in Charleston, South Carolina, not that far from the Atlantic Ocean. This part of Charleston draws lots of tourists, many of whom come to admire the city's distinctive historic homes. When you walk here at night, the streets are lit by lovely gas lamps. But Charleston's charm came at a price, a very high price.
This was a real slave mart. People were bought and sold here between 1856 and 1863. And this is our timeline right here along this curve of wall.
This is the old Slave Mart Museum in Charleston, South Carolina.
And all this would be open space from which they can be exercised. Again, muscle tone look good on the auction block.
Of the millions of enslaved people who were brought to America against their will, many arrived here through the port of Charleston.
Here you also have 20-foot walls around here to make an effective slave pen from which they cannot escape.
In 1856, Charleston banned open-air public slave auctions, so the business moved to an indoor slave market.
Now this is the largest of more than 40 sales rooms where you could have bought and sold another human being. 40 sales rooms meaning that these would have been more like offices. Imagine yourself a real estate agent. You don't have a house in your office to sell, but you've got the paperwork and all the stuff you need to do.
I'm Trey Kay, and from West Virginia Public Broadcasting and PRX, you're listening to Us and Them, the show that tells the stories about the things that divide us. I'm here in Charleston as part of a civil rights tour. A small group of people, mostly Northerners and one from the West, have paid for a 6-day trip to learn about America's racial past and the impact of the civil rights movement on our lives today. The tour is designed to immerse travelers with visits across several states to places that have come to define America's racial history, from Charleston's slave trade to Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. So I'm standing here in the Martin Luther King Center. It's a park that is dedicated to the principles of nonviolence. I've been to Atlanta many times before, but until this day, I'd never been to Ebenezer Baptist Church or the King Center. There's a reflecting pool here. It's a big, beautiful blue reflecting pool, and it has like little fountains and actually little waterfalls. And there's a description, or actually there's some words that say, we will not, I can't see it because the sun is glare, we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. Now, that bears repeating. It's from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s 1963 I Have a Dream speech. We will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like water and righteousness like a mighty stream. Has justice rolled down like water? Is it a mighty stream or just a trickle? And in the middle of the pool, there's a kind of like an island, and there seems to be a tomb of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., 1929 to 1968. The civil rights movement, led by Dr. King and John Lewis and Fannie Lou Hamer and James Bevel and so many others, was centered on nonviolence. The people who marched, some of whom were beaten and some of whom were killed, believed nonviolence could change hearts and minds. They believed nonviolence could end segregation. They believed nonviolence could achieve justice for Black Americans. And as you walk into the park, on this wall are printed 6 principles of nonviolence. Principle 1, nonviolence is a way of life for courageous people. Principle 2, nonviolence seeks to win friendship and understanding. Principle 3. While I was reading and thinking about these principles of nonviolence, members of our tour group were discussing them a short distance away. As I approached, I caught this exchange on tape between a man on the tour and one of the people leading the tour.
It's a total abject failure. 400 years and look at where people are. It's the same situation.
No. I appreciate you speaking candidly. The only thing I ask you, think about your choice of some of the words.
Fine.
That you use. That's all I ask you. And I did. I want you to speak candidly, and you are entitled.
David Mushler is the man who called nonviolence a failure. He's a retired lawyer from Chicago. The man who asked him to abstain from profanity is Todd Allen. He's a professor at Messiah University in Pennsylvania. I could see David Mushler's comments about nonviolence being a failure had touched a nerve in the group, probably because he raised his voice and spoke in such an animated way. So I asked him about it. It was interesting because I walked over and there was a lot of emotion.
I like to stir the pot a little bit. You know, growing up, I loved Dr. King. I mean, he was a hero of mine. I can remember the March on Washington. Listen, I can remember one of the most significant events of the civil rights era, the 50s and 60s, in my view, was the killing of the little girls in Birmingham. I mean, I think people did at that point say something to the effect of, gee, that's what we're left to, killing little girls in Sunday school? I mean, that's the best we can do.
As David was recounting those racist murders, I wondered how old he was when the civil rights movement began.
I was born in 1946, so I would have been 10 in 1956. Brown v. Board of Education, you know,
and the bus boycotts and all that.
Absolutely, and that was major news. And it's interesting that what was that major news usurped by? The Vietnam War. Vietnam took it off the headlines.
Probably with the exception of the assassination of Dr. King.
And Bobby Kennedy, of course. You know, it was a violent 60s.
With that, he turned his attention elsewhere.
I guess we're going to get some coffee?
Yes, we'll get you decaf. Maybe that'll take you down a notch.
I'm going to tell my wife you said that.
This seems like a good place to tell you more about the tour. The company that organized our trip was Mejdi Tours. Mejdi is an Arabic word meaning honor and respect. The company was co-founded by a Palestinian-American named Aziz Abu Sarah. They offer tours in the U.S. and international locations, and their specialty is cultural immersion, offering multiple perspectives from diverse leaders. During this civil rights tour, over the course of 6 days, the group traveled hundreds of miles across several states. In the bus, along the way, there were lots of conversations, discussions, and even some debates about what people were seeing and thinking. Occasionally, Abu Sarah would talk about his childhood in the Middle East.
I grew up in Jerusalem, Palestinian. I became very radicalized when I was a kid after my brother especially got killed in the first Palestinian uprising.
People on the bus listened closely to Abu Sarah's story.
Became very active politically in a movement called the Fatah movement in Jerusalem. For me, revenge anger, bitterness was my motivation growing up.
Abu Sarah was a teenager at the time. During the uprising, people threw rocks, and Israeli soldiers lobbed tear gas, which is why Abu Sarah's mother insisted he carry an onion to school.
If you cut an onion when there's tear gas and you put it close to your nose, it helps you not suffocate. And so the only way I felt comfortable going to school because of this was to have an onion with me and have a plastic knife, and I'll cut the onion. And unfortunately, I did need to use it too many times. But that was the normal childhood I grew up with, which is crazy to say normal. But in my mind, I really thought everybody probably in the world goes to school with an onion.
After high school, things changed.
Anyway, when I was 18, I ended up having a big shift when I went to study Hebrew. And I did that mainly because you can't live in Jerusalem without Hebrew. Before that, I refused to learn it because it was the language of the other. And when I studied Hebrew, I studied it in a Jewish institute called Ulpan, which is when, if you're Jewish American, you want to immigrate to Israel, that's where you go to study Hebrew. So I was the only Palestinian, and that was my first real interaction with, quote-unquote, the other. And that's where my views on things started shifting, mainly from the concept of us versus them, as in Palestinians versus Israelis, or Arabs, Muslims versus Jews, to us versus them as those of us who believe in justice, in peace, in equality, versus those who don't yet.
Abu Sarah's done a lot of things in his life. He hosted a radio show in 2 languages, Arabic and Hebrew. He led an organization for bereaved families. He directed the Center for Conflict Resolution at George Mason University. Then, in 2009, he started Mejdi as a cultural exploration vehicle. The night before we visited the King Center in Atlanta, I had dinner with Todd Allen and Aziz Abu Sarah, the 2 men leading this cultural exploration tour. It was a busy Saturday night in downtown Atlanta.
That's the good one. Have you tried that one?
No, I haven't.
It's not bad. One of my favorites.
All right.
If it's recommended, my boy did a good job, so.
Sounds good.
We sat outside, ordered wine, and talked about race.
I've been with people, and not just people of faith, but I've been with some whites who are very uncomfortable about conversations of race and conversations of racism.
I've heard people I know who talked about, well, why can't they get over it? It happened.
They meaning you're pointing to Todd, who's a black man. Right?
Yeah. Why can't they get over it? You know, slavery ended 150 years ago, more now, 160, 70 years ago. So why they still so hung on it? And yeah, there was some problems after, but everything is perfect now.
Todd Allen could relate to that. In 2017, the minister of a church invited him to discuss racial justice issues. Just before that event was scheduled, white supremacists marched on Charlottesville, Virginia, waving Nazi and Confederate flags. A man in a speeding car killed a counter-protester. Allen feared the congregation might cancel his address.
And at one point, the pastor was doing this prayer of repentance and reconciliation and pouring out his heart of personal experiences of things that he had thought, done, and believed growing up in the South, right? And in the midst of that prayer, someone shouted from the back of this large sanctuary, "Get over it." And I sat there, I never turned around, but I sat there kind of in shock. And at first I thought, Well, I don't think we needed that little bit of extra drama. The weekend has been dramatic enough. And why wouldn't the pastor tell me that they were going to have somebody like act that out, right? And I'm looking at the pastor, and I realized this was a shock to him. His face went in less than 10 seconds from shock to hurt to anger. And I was like, oh my God, that was real. Somebody just really shouted out, get over it. When I got up, I said, I want to talk about what just happened. I said, someone shouted out, get over it. You can't overlook that disturbance that just happened. I said, I don't know if the gentleman's still here, but if he were here, I would begin by asking him, what is the it we need to get over? And until you can tell me what the it is that we need to get over, how do we get over it? We have been, as a nation, practiced more unfreedom, more undemocracy, more uncitizenship longer than we've ever practiced democracy, citizenship, and justice and equality.
Todd Allen was on a roll, so I kept quiet.
I know some people think, 1619, that's a controversial date to pick. All right, well, if you want to move it up a little bit and just pick what you believe to be the start of slavery, we go right from slavery to Jim Crow. The Voting Rights Act was passed in 65. And everyone said, okay, I guess we'll let everybody vote. Oh, and I guess we'll let people live by one another. Oh, and I guess we'll integrate the schools. No. Just as you see strides being made to move towards what we ought to be and who we ought to be as a nation, there are people always working to undo that. Yeah, so, when in the movement, when they sing that freedom's a constant struggle, that's just what it is. I don't think on this side of eternity, we're going to get to a point where we have resolved and we have fully repaired and we have become one. That doesn't mean that we don't continue to work towards, what Dr. King called the beloved community, but it is a daily and a constant struggle.
I think just to add to what you say, Todd, 70%, something like that, of Alabama income after slavery ended was based on incarcerated people working in white people farms and plantations. Crazy. And you keep going struggle after struggle because there is no partnership. And just because Barack Obama became president, that's not partnership. That is totally misunderstanding it.
I want to go back to something Todd said earlier. You have had these tours before, the ones that you have conducted that have not been with Aziz, where somebody comes up to you, it's a white person, they sit down and they say they're so glad that they came, and somebody said to them, hey, don't go on that tour. They're just going to tell you that white people are bad, etc. I wanted to make sure that I let you know, Todd, that before I've come on this tour, I have heard that. I've heard you're going to go down there and you're going to go, through the deep South, and basically they're going to tell you the woke version of our civil rights history.
I think you'll also hear, I don't want to let African Americans off the hook. Aziz talked about the ongoing trauma. There will be people who will say to me, well, you be careful down there. Are you sure you want to go? And I explained to those people, I said, worse things have happened to me up south than have ever happened to me down south. And I said, if you're wondering what I mean by up south, I mean Pennsylvania, I mean Ohio, I mean New York, up south. Aziz mentioned the lack of any kind of a truth and reconciliation process. And part of a truth and reconciliation process is truth. Truth telling and truth listening. And that's hard because so often people want to listen to respond rather than listen to understand. They only want to hear praise. They don't want to hear condemnation. They only want to hear how great we are. They don't want to hear how we fall short. That is a heaviness. That's going to make your heart hurt. If you've got an ounce of humanity, it ought to make your heart hurt. Lament is part of that, right? We can't get to repair and restoration till we've effectively gone through the hurt, the healing, the truth-telling.
After a break, we'll hear how confronting America's past is affecting one woman today.
Really scary that I can live for 60 years in my own white bubble with such limited information.
You're listening to Us and Them. This program is supported in part by the West Virginia Humanities Council and the CRC Foundation.
Music lifts us up and brings us together, even when we can't get together in person. Mountain Stage brings you live performances on the air, online, and in our podcast. They remind you how it feels to be in a live audience listening to live music. This is Larry Gross, host of Mountain Stage. Find a link to our stations and our podcast online at mountainstage.org.
Hey, Trey here, and you're listening to Us and Them from PRX and West Virginia Public Broadcasting. One day in Atlanta, everyone on the Civil Rights Tour gathered into a conference room for a history lesson from someone who lived it.
Oh, freedom, oh, freedom, oh, freedom over me, over me. And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free.
That's Charles Person singing "Oh Freedom." He talked with NBC News about his role as one of the original Freedom Riders. In 1961, he was just an 18-year-old freshman at Morehouse College. But he was determined to challenge segregation.
Reason we were started off in D.C. and we were headed to New Orleans for the May 17th. Why? Because that was the anniversary of the Brown versus the Board of Education decision. Even though the decision had been made, many states were fighting it. Whites were fleeing to the suburbs. They were opening up private schools, all kinds of things.
The Freedom Riders purchased seats on public buses to challenge segregation. Person, who is black, was part of an integrated group of activists trained in nonviolence. When the riders reached Atlanta, they met with Reverend Martin Luther King Jr.
He was trying to discourage us from continuing. He said, I understand that terrible things await you in Alabama. He said, the word is you guys won't make it out of Alabama. Now, we had a tremendous amount of respect for Dr. King, but we had a job to do.
So they kept going. Once the bus Person was riding on crossed from Georgia to Alabama, Person remembers a white passenger saying this to him and the other Freedom Riders.
You have had it good here in Georgia. He said, but you're in Alabama now. Well, I'm saying, wow, I'm not worried about this guy. He's getting off the bus. But little did I know, in a couple hours, I would see him again in Birmingham.
Turns out that white man was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. When the Trailways bus arrived in Birmingham, that KKK member and others were waiting. They'd alerted the police to their plan to beat up the riders when they arrived to integrate the segregated area at the bus depot.
James Peck and I, we were the designated testers. And so I knew James had already been beaten extremely badly, and he was bleeding, but he wanted to continue. So I said, let's go. We go into the waiting room, and the entire wall of men came towards us. They had every conceivable weapon,
including a metal pipe. In the only surviving photograph from that day, that wall of men, a mob really, can be seen attacking Person and Peck.
James went on down almost immediately, and I guess I'm being younger, I was able to maintain my balance. James ended up receiving 53 stitches for all the wounds that he received.
Person was beaten too.
You'll find that there's a certain source of strength in being nonviolent. And what happens is that when you're being beaten and you're not fighting back, eventually the person who's doing the beating is frustrating. They can't go back and brag how they beat you up when you weren't fighting back.
Person's actions had a big, big impact.
We had no expectation of what the success we were going to have. You know, we were doing stuff, but we didn't know whether we were going to be successful or not.
More than 400 Freedom Riders participated in at least 60 separate Freedom Rides. Those rides helped end separate and incredibly unequal public accommodations in the South.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dave.
Sometimes a hand helps.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Thank you. Kyle, should I close it?
Yeah, go ahead and close it.
As the tour bus took us from place to place, there was a lot of time to reflect on America and ourselves. One stop on the tour took the group to Kelly Ingram Park in Birmingham, Alabama.
Realizing the deaths had occurred right there, and then the fire hoses and the dogs against the children.
Betsy Disharoon is a retired dentist from Massachusetts. On the bus, she talked about seeing places in Birmingham near the park where civil rights protesters were met with force and weapons.
The energy was just overwhelming for me, to the point where I didn't even want to go over to the church and the park. And I had to really use a lot of determination to go experience that further, because the emotions were very, very strong.
As the trip continued with stops in Atlanta and Augusta, Georgia, I noticed that Betsy Disharoon was one of the most outspoken members of the group. She's very soft-spoken, so sometimes I had to lean in forward to hear her carefully chosen words. On the road from Augusta, Georgia to Charleston, South Carolina, Disharoon raised a topic with the group. Should white people like her, and everyone else who paid to be on this tour, rely on black people to educate them about racism?
But this concept that white people shouldn't fully depend on people of color to educate them, we're not living that out right now. We're asking people of color to educate us. So how can we, in this group, take another step to look at ourselves as white people and educate ourselves as white people and our privilege?
I want Todd to answer that, but he's napping.
But that would be asking a black person to educate us.
Right, yes and no.
This is Aziz Abu Sarah again. He and Todd are both guiding the tour.
I'm careful to say, here's what we should do to learn about black people from my perspective. I'd like to be guided, at least, by somebody like Todd. I can tell you from a Palestinian perspective, so that will be easier for me. I don't have problem with people asking me as a Palestinian to educate them. I really never have. And I think most of my Palestinian friends wouldn't. I don't know if that's the case here. So I'm cautious about answering about the states because it's not my experience. But like, for example, on this tour, I don't think it would have been right for me to bring a white person to lead this tour.
No, but maybe it would be like in this forum right here, there's potential for us looking at ourselves and seeing how much we are just pitying the people of color versus how much are we learning about ourselves and our own attitudes?
I agree.
Todd Allen was on the bus. He heard the conversation. He heard his name mentioned, but he didn't say anything. That brief clapping you heard, that was applause from Todd Allen. Later that day, over a bowl of shrimp and grits at the Sweetwater Cafe in Charleston, South Carolina, I asked him what happened.
Well, I can't remember the exact question that started off, but the basic idea was, as white people, what do we need to be doing in moments like this to educate and equip ourselves to come along? I thought that was a great question, and I thought it, again, did not warrant that I jump into that. I'm not white. Well, I got a little bit, but I'm not white. And so that was a conversation for them to have amongst themselves. I did talk to a couple of people who, obviously, since I didn't comment, but I did clap, asked me.
Why did you clap?
That was an endorsement of when one person said, well, I wonder what Todd thinks. And then somebody responded, no, it's not on Todd to do the work for us. It's ours. And that's what I clapped to, was somebody acknowledging,
And as you're saying that, Kyle's got a huge smile on his face. Kyle is Kyle Stovall. He's eating shrimp and grits with Todd Allen and me. He's a black man from Tuscaloosa, Alabama. He's 40 years old, and he's the guy driving the tour bus over hundreds of miles of southern highways.
Once I heard the conversation start, I knew probably where it would go, and I just decided I would put my headphones on.
Where did you think it would go?
Down a rabbit hole of drama, just based on the conversations that have happened in the past.
Todd Allen had thoughts on this too.
If I were going to say anything, they talked about this idea of allyship. Because, if you were to say to any of the white folk that I know from the movement, if you were to call them an ally, they would non-violently slap you. They were not an ally. An ally still is like, well, I've got the option to join this, and I'm going to do this for you. No, they were fellow citizens who realized that their citizenship was caught up in the citizenship of others. Because others were not free, they were not free. Their humanity, as King often said, was bound in the humanity of others. So they weren't there doing colored people a favor. They were there because for as much as they thought they were free and full citizens of the United States, how could they be when others are not?
There are sites and museums all across the South that put the country's racist history on display. As a driver, Kyle Stovall sees lots of tourists who miss the point.
It's not about the food, it's not about the weather, it's not about this. It's about the information that you get. It's about your mind being open and absorbing what's going on and then using it for something. Not just because you've been to all these places to collect books that, Todd said, hey, that's a good book. And now everybody's talking about the book in the back like they've got a library of Black history somewhere, and I know they don't. But it's like, okay, someone told you to read the book, you bought the book, and now that's all I hear. So, in with the headphones, up goes the music volume, drive down the road.
I think to what Kyle is saying, that summer after the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, you get the point, the list goes on. The popular thing to do for a lot of people was join a book club. Books were flying off the shelves, right? But, and I don't want to dismiss book clubs because heaven knows I lead a lot of them and I'm part of them. But that's not the only thing to be done. Again, what do you do with that information that's in that book club? And do you have the resilience to lean into the hard stuff that's going to come up in that book club? The beauty of being here in Charleston is they're about to get the opportunity to lean into some hard history on slavery and dehumanization, right? Some people are going to want to look the other way, and I get that. And that's when you have to fight that urge and tune in. I was in a book club with someone and I won't name what the book is because the book was not that great, but this person's whole demeanor in the book club showed why we have the problems we have of having sustained, persistent conversations about race. By week 3, they dropped out because they said, we're only 3 chapters into the book, and they said, this is too much. I can't handle it. It's just too heavy. I'm like, you can't handle discussing a book on an experience that I have had to live for 52 years, and you can't handle 7 weeks in a book club.
Charleston, South Carolina. Our last stop on the Civil Rights Tour was an important one, the McLeod Plantation Historic Site.
It's a big, huge plantation. They grew cotton here. I'm walking over right now to, they have like a little patch of cotton that is grown here.
The plantation is home to majestic live oak trees and John McLeod's impressive 19th century home. Also on the grounds are tiny shacks where enslaved people slept when they weren't working in McLeod's fields. As I was exploring the grounds, I bumped into someone I knew.
Betsy, how you doing this morning?
Betsy Disharoon seemed to be deep in thought, walking by herself and thinking. I asked her what was on her mind.
My first marriage, 10th anniversary, was spent at a plantation.
In Louisiana?
In Louisiana, just north of New Orleans.
Yeah.
And of course, we looked at it as just a very fine place to stay. We weren't consciously thinking of the history.
Right.
And it was something that struck me on this trip that these buildings really were built by slaves, and they didn't have any investment other than sweat in it. So far from ownership. It's really striking me at a deeper level today.
Good morning, 10 o'clock visitors.
Good morning.
Welcome. We're going to step over this way here. We'll get started in about 1 minute.
This is John Gardner. He's our tour guide here.
Well, once again, good morning to each of you, and welcome to the McLeod Historic Plantation Site. We very seldom get a group this size early in the morning, but I'm very pleased to see you here.
We made our way to the plantation house. It's big and white. 4 two-story pillars greeted us. Gardner began telling us about the riches amassed by plantation owner John McLeod.
He did exceptionally well. Built a very strong financial base for himself. Very strong financial base. Now, you heard me talk about Charleston wealth. Charleston wealth is to be considered exceptional. Super exceptional.
That's because Charleston's wealth was created by slave labor.
They would have these palatial mansions and homes down in a place called the Battery, downtown Charleston, near the water. Palatial homes that sometimes go back in families well over 100 years. Palatial homes, buildings, and churches down there were all built by enslaved labor. Carpenters, brick masons, artisans.
After the plantation tour, I caught up with Betsy Disharoon again. She's 71 now and says her attitudes regarding race have evolved.
And most of the awareness has just happened in the last 10 years. It's just really scary that I can live for 60 years in my own white bubble with such limited information.
When you say the last 10 years, is there anything in particular that you can point to that kind of caused the change?
Yeah. I joined a meditation group that was more than half people of color. And we became very close. It wasn't just meditation, it was social interaction. And that was the first real friends I had of color.
Ever?
Yeah.
Sometime later, back at home, I found myself still thinking about the tour and everything I'd learned, and still needed to learn, which made me think of Betsy Disharoon. She'd been kind enough to open up to me and challenge all of us. So I asked if I could drive up to Massachusetts and talk to her some more.
Why did you sign up to go on the Civil Rights Tour?
It had an excellent reputation. The organizer had an excellent reputation of bringing different sides together. That interested me a lot because in my self-education and work with racial justice, I make a big effort to look at as many sides as possible.
When you and I talked several times during the tour, and one of the things you said to me really stuck in my head. You said, a lot of white people try to make a difference by writing checks or by reading books. Is that enough?
I don't believe so. I think that we've got to change the systems by living differently, and writing checks and educating themselves is not enough. You've really got to change habits, thoughts, in order to want to change the system.
Disharoon has tried to do just that. She's helped organize a group in her city called Courageous Conversations Toward Racial Justice. I decided to ask her about the conversation she initiated on the tour bus, about how white people shouldn't ask Black Americans to lead every single racial justice conversation.
Did you note that as we were traveling about that day, there were two Black people on the bus? One was driving the bus. The other person was in the rear of the bus. That was Todd. And in the middle, there were all of us white people and I guess one Palestinian. Did you notice that the Black people were not a part of that conversation?
I definitely noticed that. To expect Todd to participate in the conversation is to continue to expect Black people to educate us. And white people talking among themselves, opening their minds up, and thinking from different perspectives is what we need to do.
Remember what Disharoon said about living in a white bubble? I asked her a little more about that.
I'm glad you brought up the whole thing about a white bubble. That was something that I remember you speaking about. Is there a bit of shame in being in the white bubble?
Definitely there's shame. If you evaluate the white culture that we were brought up in and what it has done to the non-dominant, the marginalized population, it's really scary and shameful to look back on.
For Disharoon, that shame includes easy access to home loans when Black people were denied them.
The VA loans for homes, I personally experienced benefit from that. Growing up, my parents owned several homes, and each time they got a VA loan. Looking back, I'm now learning that Black people were excluded from those loans either because of redlining or because the loans were of such high interest they couldn't afford it.
After my conversation with Betsy, I thought about something Todd Allen said the night we went out for dinner with Aziz Abu Sarah in Atlanta. I asked him what difference he thought the Civil Rights Tour might have on participants. This is what he told me.
You know, part of the answer to your question is, going forward, what difference will these 9 days have made for you in the spaces that you occupy? When you see something that's not right, what will you do?
What will I do? Well, I promise to speak up against discrimination. And when I hear a Black person tell me of their experiences with racism, I will listen for understanding rather than listening just to respond. And while listening, I promise to remember the things that may seem inconceivable to me are a reality for someone who's lived a different life. And when it is appropriate to speak, I'm going to ask questions with the intention to learn more. Healing the trauma from America's centuries of racism and white-dominated culture might be the most important and most difficult challenge facing our nation. Doing this work requires serious self-reflection and a fearless moral inventory. And finally, I promise to remember that we must take on this incredibly complex work together. And in doing so, I understand that it's not about achieving perfection, but rather making measurable, meaningful progress. You've been listening to Us and Them. Our team for this episode is me, Trey Kay, Todd Melby, Brad Stratton, and Kate Smith. Thanks to Susan Jaremski-Homer, Shannon Okuengai, and Aziz Abu Sarah of Mejdi Tours. Thanks to Professor Todd Allen and Kyle Stovall for fantastic conversations over great Southern food and libations. And special thanks to Betsy, Dave, Anne, Linda, Alice, Valerie, and Trusha for taking such an important tour and putting up with me as I tagged along. Michael Lipton and Tristan Lozow wrote and performed the Us and Them show music. Mark Lerner designed our logo. Lelena Price provides us with images for the web. And Jane Sears Wright helps us with the invaluable service of helping us secure our funding. The marvelous people at PRX and West Virginia Public Broadcasting make Us and Them possible. So do grants from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the West Virginia Humanities Council, and the CRC Foundation. Us and Them was originally developed with assistance from the mentorship program at AIR, the Association of Independents in Radio. We'll see you next time on Us and Them. This episode of Us and Them was first released in December of 2021.
Support for this podcast comes from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.